As we're wondering about the future of not only our countries, but our people and maybe the planet under the conditions of COVID-19, we're having conversations in various directions, certainly in the United States, which is so hard hit by this virus, and of course also by a failed political and economic response. We're also talking to people in other countries, and today we're talking with Sue Richardson, who is with us from England. Sue is a theological advisor for Christian Aid. She's currently furloughed, which means that she's not officially working. And of course, always keep in mind, this is Sue's perspectives. She's not speaking in any official capacity for Christian Aid. So thank you so much for being with us today, Sue. And we're very curious to learn about some of your takes and thoughts about COVID-19 from the perspective of Great Britain.
Well, it's great to be with you, Joerg, to talk again. COVID-19 was something that crept up on us in the UK quite slowly. And in February, when it was already wreaking havoc in other parts of the world, our government was still acting as though it was never going to come here. So there's been a sense somehow of English exceptionalism in the way we faced the virus and the way we've decided to deal with it. Because when it did come to our shores, we seemed very slow to take account of the impact it could have on certain parts of the population, on the impact it could have on our economy, on the impact it could have about people's psychology. And generally speaking, the public seemed to lead the way in their response to the virus. So once the cases started to grow, the infection started to spread, people voluntarily stopped going around to leisure events or to social events. And the government in the end had to follow suit, and we went into lockdown, and we are still in lockdown, although again, the public are pushing the government, some of them, I believe, are pushing our government to release us from that lockdown so that normal life, whatever you call it, can come back. And we can start to go to work again, or we can start to meet our neighbors. At the moment, we are distanced. That's the idea. They call it social distancing. And I prefer physical distancing because I don't like the implications of being socially distant in a community. So we are encouraged to be physically distant from people who are not in our household by about 2 meters. So when you go shopping, you maintain that distance, you queue to get into the shops. You do not go out except to take some exercise, and when you do, you keep distant again from people, and you were only allowed out for an hour, but now that's been relaxed. You cannot move in a social circle outside your household. So it means I haven't sat down and had a chat with a friend except through technology. I haven't been able to touch my grandchildren. I have seen them at a distance, and they cannot run to me, which as small children they might do. We are faced with a degree of uncertainty about where this is going to go for us, but certainly our economy is shaken, and a lot of measures have had to be put into place to keep that going. But what concerns me most is the social implications of what we're experiencing, in that I fear we are pushing 2 sets of people apart. So there's always the set that are a bit feckless, who will take risks. And they seem to be in our population becoming more extreme. So they will take risks despite the recommendations or the rules. And then there's always a segment of the population who are slightly more cautious. And what's happened is they've taken to the lockdown quite well, really, and now they don't want to come out. And friends of mine are talking about, I'm not coming out till it feels safe. And we live in a world, I feel, that is never completely safe. So what's coming into question is how we move past seeing everybody we meet as a threat, because that's what's being encouraged with this distancing. How we start to interrogate the other. We've talked before, you and I, Joerg, about the otherness of things and people, and we are certainly creating a sense of otherness here, both in divisions between people's psychology about this and in divisions between their political adherence to the program the government's offering, but also just in terms of how we're going to go on and build a society and what we're going to risk to do it.
Yeah, there are lots of things to consider, and thanks for helping us see some of the complexity in your context, which it seems to me is handled fairly well, because there seems to be some responsiveness to the problem and some shared concern among the public. What's curious to me is in this situation, we have talked about working people, perhaps in a new way in the United States. We have talked about essential workers, that is to say, workers that, are essential to keep not only the economy going, but really to keep people fit, to keep people sort of serviced, service workers, grocery workers, food workers, agricultural workers, and so on. In Britain, you call them key workers. It's a different word here, but I think the concept is the same. And in an earlier communication, you mentioned those key workers to me. So what exactly is the role and maybe also the promise of this new perspective?
The key worker thing is really provoking, because they are people who are on the front line in healthcare provision and social care provision, those who look after your elderly relatives in a care home or visit them on a daily basis. But of course, those who are working in hospitals and dealing with the direct effects of the virus, then there are all sorts who have suddenly been discovered. People who empty our bins, we have rubbish collection here every week. They are key workers. Teachers are key workers, and they've become much more than key teachers. They've become social workers, because they closed the schools for most of the children. But it was understood that these key workers would have children who would need to be looked after. And their nurseries were closed, their childminders weren't working. So the schools were opened up for them, and teachers were called in to look after them. And beyond that, to take responsibility for contacting those who might be considered vulnerable children, children in deprived circumstances, children in dysfunctional families or difficult families, maintaining contact with them to make sure that they were well, and where possible, bringing them into school to release some of the pressure that might be generated. Now, to me, what's interesting is all these people don't earn very well in our society. And barely a month before this virus broke out, we were having parliamentary discussions about immigration, which categorized this whole sector as being low skilled, not doctors perhaps, but certainly nurses, certainly the bin men, certainly the carers. They were all categorized as not earning enough to enable someone who was coming from outside our country to come here and gain right to stay and work. In other words, we were going to put up a barrier to low-skilled people coming into the country. This was something that our newly elected government felt it had been given a mandate for. So in February, all these people were low-skilled and not desirable. And at the end of March, they were all highly desirable. Their skills were being reevaluated. Their pay was the same. And in fact, one of the annoying things is that despite having organized public displays of support for these people, we go out of our houses on Thursday evenings to clap for a few moments at 8 o'clock for the people who are serving us like this. There has been no sign from the people who are in charge of us that their service is going to be recognized other than applause, or even perhaps a medal. They struck a badge for them that they could wear. Certainly no increase in salary, but there has to be a change in the perception of the general public. These people who were low skilled and not desirable have become the people who actually keep our economy together. And it's their sacrifice and it's their risk, and they go out to serve us, to minister to us, to care for us, that is actually keeping us together as a nation and allowing us to move through this. So for me, I was really interested in the inversion of these terms, how someone who had low value could become high value because of the impact of the virus. And those who sit making money through banking have suddenly, well, apart from the hedge fund people who are making billions, but these other people have suddenly been revealed to actually not contribute that much to the economy we need on a daily basis at all.
I think that's the crucial point here. It's a reversal. It's not merely a matter of seeing others the way we haven't seen them before. That is, of course, at the heart of it. But it's also seeing the rest of us in the contributions that we're really making. And so on the one hand, I think what you just said, people that up to now we might have thought were essential for not only the economy but human flourishing may not be as essential, and others really come to the fore who are rising to the occasion. That to me is a really important takeaway that that connects us in our conversations. Now, if you continue thinking along those lines, of course, we're theologians. And so for us, the question is, what about our own essential nature, right? What exactly are we contributing here that might be useful or maybe not so useful? And so let me ask you the question about theological resources, because as we stated, you are the theological advisor for Christian Aid in Great Britain. So what are your thoughts here about theological resources that might be useful, maybe even useful roles that theologians might play as we continue along this line of work?
There's a great desire here amongst the sectors I liaise with, that I relate to build a new something after this. And so the question is, where do we get the resourcing? Where do we draw the values from to create that new something, that new normal? I was struck almost immediately by the fact that the virus is intimately related to all sorts of other issues that I've been concerned about in my working life. The environment, climate change, poverty, debt relief, inequality, race, class. It seemed to me that the virus was apocalyptic. So I've got a number of strands of theological thought here going on, but one of them is that this virus is truly apocalyptic in the real sense of the word, where it is removing the veil from the reality that we have been blinded to for so long. I don't know why. I don't know whether it's complacency. I don't know whether it's ignorance, but we have lived in an economy and in a social structure that is essentially broken. It doesn't work. It's not fit for purpose. And perhaps we needed the virus to show us that. So I'm really interested in encouraging people to think of it as a break with what they understood was the way life was, in order to be creatively thinking about the way life might be. And the other strand that struck me was that Jesus, when he healed, and this is a virus, so it's intimately related with our health, and whether we get it or not, we are having health implications, psychological effects maybe, or other health matters that we're not pursuing because we don't want to go to hospital, we don't want to go anywhere near the virus. So it's got its health implications. Therefore, there needs to be healing. And reading the New Testament's full of encounters of Jesus with people who sought healing of various kinds, much of it physical, but it was never only physical. It was always about, it seems to me, the drawing back of people out of a situation of exclusion, of ostracism, of suffering, of being distinctly different and overlooked, into a fully functioning community again. And a friend of mine happened to ask, I wonder what it was like for Lazarus when he came out of the tomb and looked at the world again. And then I was reading Mark, and I found that passage where Jesus heals the blind man. And yes, he heals them, and presumably it's a new life for him, and he doesn't have to beg anymore and all that. But Jesus then says to him, do not go back into the village. I don't think he says that to everyone he heals. But the fact that he said it to this man struck home with me, because of that we must not go back to the old ways. We must not go back into that village that has shaped us and driven us forward as though that was the only way we could go as a community. We need to move on and see new places and new ways of being. And then I was reading a novel this morning, Hilary Mantel, trilogy about Thomas Cromwell, and she spoke about the same thing, the healing of the blind man, and said, when he gets his sight back, the faces of those around him who he knows by touch and sound are all foreign to him. Even if he knew them before he went blind, they are now new to him and different. He doesn't even recognize his own face in the mirror. What I think we need to do as a society is to realize that COVID has unveiled a mirror for us, but unlike a mere reflection, it's also going to illuminate into the darkest parts of the way we've lived, and invite us to see again all that goes on around us, but also ourselves in it as new people in new situations. Does that sound too fanciful?
No, I think this is really right on. Very powerful too, because it's this new way of seeing, I think, that's upon us. And when we talked about these key workers a minute ago, this is the thing, right? This was always there. We just didn't really notice it as much. We didn't pay attention to it as much. Adding to that, I would say, this is new ways of seeing God in the end as well. Where traditionally, very often, we thought about God as somebody sitting up on a throne up in the sky. And now we're realizing maybe God is more like one of these key workers. God is with us in ways that we hadn't really thought about that much. And so this apocalyptic moment, I really like the way you put this in the beginning, is something that can be extremely powerful. And maybe this is where us theologians then need to do some of the work. How do we carry this further? How do we popularize these conversations? How do we help people see the kinds of things that they hadn't seen as yet? One more thought occurs to me, and this has to do with a conversation that's common in some of the apocalyptic literature, and this is the end of the world. So sometimes people think, so apocalyptic translates into end of the world. It doesn't, as you just said, it translates into being unveiled, seeing with new eyes. But this conversation about the end of the world, I think, relates to it, because when you see with new eyes, something ends. Now, what ends, of course, is not the world as such, but the world of empire. That's the big difference, right? Ending here is not, the planet is going to blow up in smoke, but ending, for some of this apocalyptic literature is the various empires that they were confronted with. Back when the Roman Empire was certainly one of them. Today, we'd have to have more conversations about what our empires look like and what is ending here. And as far as I'm concerned, I think this ending is good news. So thank you so much, Sue, for all your thoughts and your reflections. It's always refreshing to be in conversation with people who are engaged in various contexts, certainly in England, but also around the globe. And so thanks again, and I look forward to continuing our conversation at some point.
Thanks, Joerg. It's a pleasure as always.